Chapter 7. The Robbery. A few days later, a visitor arrived in London from Oliver's hometown. He was a large, fat man, and very proud of his hat, which showed the world that he was a most important official. It was, in fact, Mr. Bumble the Beadle, Oliver's old enemy. Mr. Bumble had completed his business in the city and had just finished a most satisfactory meal in a pub. He pulled up his chair to the fire to enjoy his hot gin and water in comfort and opened the newspaper. The first thing he saw was this notice. A reward of £5 is offered for any information leading to the discovery of a young boy, Oliver Twist, who was kidnapped from his home in Pentonville last Thursday evening. I am also very interested in any information about his past. There was then a full description of Oliver's clothes and appearance, and Mr. Brownlow's full address. Mr. Bumble rubbed his eyes, read the notice again, and was at the address in less than 10 minutes. He was shown into Mr. Brownlow's study, where the old gentleman and his friend Mr. Grimwig were sitting. "Do you know where the poor boy is now?" Mr. Brownlow asked, when the beadle had explained the reason for his visit. Mr. Bumble shook his head. "Do you know anything good about him?" asked Mr. Grimwig, looking closely at Mr. Bumble's face. Mr. Bumble shook his head again, very seriously, and turned down the corners of his mouth. "Then tell us everything you know about him," said Mr. Brownlow impatiently. Mr. Bumble put down his hat, unbuttoned his coat, folded his arms, and sat back in his chair. He spoke in his most important and official voice, and talked for 20 minutes. His listeners heard all the details of Oliver's illegitimate birth, and how generously he had been treated as a workhouse orphan. They heard how he had always been an ungrateful and dangerous child, violently attacking another boy, and finally running away from the house where he had been working. The old gentleman shook his head sadly and gave Mr. Bumble the £5. "I would have been happy to give you 3 times the amount if your story had proved that the boy was good." If Mr. Bumble had known this earlier, he might have told a different story, but now it was too late, so he took the money and left. Mr. Brownlow walked up and down his room for several minutes, deep in thought. He rang the bell for Mrs. Bedwin, his housekeeper, and told her what he had heard. "I don't believe it," she said, with great certainty. "I was right," said Mr. Grimwig, with satisfaction. "You should have listened to what I said." Mr. Brownlow said angrily, "Never let me hear the boy's name again. Never. Remember that, Mrs. Bedwin." There were sad hearts at Mr. Brownlow's house that night. Meanwhile, in another part of London, Oliver remained a prisoner. Fagin had told Oliver how ungrateful he had been to run away. He had told him that he would have died of hunger without Fagin's kindness. He went on to tell Oliver the story of another young boy who had gone to the police to tell them about the gang, but who had finally been hanged one morning for being a thief. Fagin described the hanging in terrifying detail, and said that he hoped he would never have to tell the police about Oliver, and see Oliver with a rope around his neck. Oliver felt his blood turn cold. He remained locked in a room for many days, seeing nobody between early morning and midnight. He spent his time thinking sadly about his friends in Pentonville. After a week, he was free to wander round the house during the day. It was a dirty place, full of rats and insects, but no other living thing. All the windows were closed and covered with wood and metal bars that kept out the light. One afternoon, the Dodger and Charlie Bates were at home, and they started telling Oliver about their lives as thieves. "Why don't you become one?" Charlie asked him. "We all are here. Both of us, and Fagin, Sykes, Nancy, all of us." "I don't want to be," replied Oliver. "I wish they'd let me go." "But it's a good life," the Dodger said, taking some coins from his pocket and throwing them up in the air. "What does it matter where the money comes from?" he said, laughing. "If you don't steal it, someone else will. You can be sure of that." Fagin entered at this point with 2 young men and joined in the conversation. One of the young men had just come out of prison, and there were many cheerful jokes about his very short haircut. Everybody sat around the fire, talking and laughing for hours. Fagin told Oliver how good the Dodger was at his job, and what a friendly boy Charlie was. It was, without doubt, an interesting evening for Oliver, after so many days locked up alone. After that evening he was rarely on his own again. He spent a lot of time with the Dodger and Charlie, and often played the handkerchief game with them. At other times, Fagin would tell them all about robberies he had committed in his younger days, telling the stories so well and putting in so many funny details that Oliver could not stop laughing, even though he knew it was wrong. Fagin knew what he was doing. He had made sure that Oliver was so lonely and miserable that he would be desperate for any friends, however criminal. Slowly and deliberately, Fagin was trying to poison the young boy's mind. One damp, cold, windy night a few weeks later, Fagin put on his heavy coat and, with the collar pulled up high to hide his face, left his home. He walked fast through the streets, never losing his way even in the darkest places. Finally, he reached an evil, narrow street lit only by a single lamp. He knocked on a door, said something quietly to the person who opened it, then walked upstairs. Bill Sikes was sitting by his fire with his dog when Fagin entered. The room was a small, dark place with almost no furniture. Nancy was there too, and Fagin glanced at her uneasily. He had not seen her since she had attacked him to stop him hitting Oliver. However, she seemed to have forgotten all about it because she told him to pull up a chair and warm himself by the fire.
"I'm ready for business," Bill Sikes said, looking at Fagin suspiciously. "Say what you have to say, Fagin."
"It's about the robbery at Chertsey, Bill," answered Fagin. "Some lovely silver in that house down there."
I know, Sikes said. "I was down there 2 nights ago to have a look at the house, but it's locked like a prison at night, all except one part."
"Where's that?"
asked Fagin, bending his head forwards, his eyes staring excitedly at Sikes.
"Do you think I'm stupid? I'm not telling you. Anyway, what we need is a boy."
"So there's a small place where only a boy can enter the house?" asked Fagin.
"Maybe, but we need a boy."
There was silence for a time, while Fagin thought. Then he made a sign to Sikes to tell Nancy to leave the room.
"Don't worry," Sikes said. "You can trust her. She won't talk. Isn't that right?"
"Of course it's right," answered the young woman, taking a large drink from the bottle on the table and laughing. "Anyway, Fagin, I know your idea is for Oliver to do the job."
"You're a clever girl," said Fagin, smiling evilly. "That's exactly what I had in mind. Listen, Bill. The boy's been training for a few weeks, and it's time he did some work. He's the smallest one, anyway."
"Is he safe?" asked Sikes. "Because if he tries any tricks on me, I'll kill him."
"He'll be ours for life if he feels he's one of us, and this job will make him feel like that," said Fagin eagerly. "The boy looks so innocent, he's perfect. And we've got to include him in some crime as soon as we can. Otherwise, if he escapes now, he can tell the police about us and stay free himself."
So it was decided that Oliver would help Sikes with the robbery in 2 days' time. The plan was discussed in great detail and all the arrangements made. By then, Sikes was very drunk, and Fagin got up to leave. As he put on his coat, he stared hard at Nancy, frowning a little. No, he was sure he could trust her. She was loyal. The next night, Oliver was alone in Fagin's house when Nancy entered. She was so nervous and white-faced that Oliver asked her if she was ill. "God forgive me," she said, beating her hands together. "I never thought I would do this." "Has anything happened?" asked the boy. "What is it?" She sat with her back to him and hid her face with her hands. After a while she said, "I don't know why I feel so strange sometimes.
Come on, Oliver, are you ready? You have to come with me to Bill's house. Why? Oh, nothing important.
Oliver did not believe her, but he thought that at last this might be an opportunity to escape, so he said rather too quickly, "I'm ready." Nancy guessed what he was thinking.
Oliver, she said, this is not the time to escape. I've saved you once and I will again, but if anything happens tonight, it might mean my death.
She said this so seriously that Oliver decided it must be true. He was quiet while they walked quickly through the streets to Sykes' house. Inside his room, Sykes sat Oliver down on a chair.
"Did he come quietly?" he asked Nancy.
"Quiet as a mouse."
"Glad to hear it," said Sykes. "Now listen to me, boy."
He put a gun against Oliver's head.
"If you say one word when you're outside with me, I'll shoot you. Understand?"
Oliver nodded, trying hard not to tremble. Sykes and Oliver started out at 5 o'clock in the morning, while it was still dark. They crossed from one side of London to the other. At first the streets were empty, then shops began to open and people started going to work. Gradually the noise and traffic increased, and as they passed through the meat market at Smithfield, Oliver was amazed by the sight and smells of so many animals and by the huge crowds of people, all pushing and swearing and shouting. But Bill Sykes marched on without stopping. Later in the day, they were given a lift in a horse and cart from West London out into the country. Night fell, and after walking a few more miles down country roads, they finally arrived at an old house standing alone by a river. It was dark and seemed to be empty. They went inside without knocking. Inside were two other men, who at Sykes' command produced food and drink for him and the boy. Then Sykes told Oliver to get some sleep, as they would be going out again later that night. Oliver still had no idea of the purpose of this expedition, but his head ached with tiredness, and he soon fell asleep. At 1:30, the men got up and checked their equipment, gathering several sticks as well. Sykes and the man called Toby left the house together, with Oliver walking between them. There was now a thick fog, and the night was very still as they hurried through the deserted streets of the nearby town. Out in the country again, they walked down several small roads, until finally they stopped at a house surrounded by a high wall. As quick as lightning, Toby climbed up and pulled Oliver after him. Inside the garden, they crept towards the house, and now, for the first time, Oliver realized in horror that the purpose of the expedition was robbery, and maybe even murder. Bill Sykes broke open a small window at the back of the house, then shone his light into Oliver's face.
"Now listen. I'm going to put you through here. Go straight through into the hall and onto the front door and let us in. And if you don't, you can be sure I'll shoot you."
Oliver, stupid with terror, was lifted through the window into the house. Desperately, he decided to try to run upstairs and warn the family. He began to creep forwards. Suddenly, there was a loud noise from the hall.
"Come back!" shouted Sykes. "Back! Back!"
Oliver stood still, frozen with fear. A light appeared, then two men on the stairs, then a sudden bright flash and a loud bang. Oliver staggered back. Sykes seized the boy's collar through the window and pulled him back out into the garden.
"They've hit him!" shouted Sykes. "He's bleeding!"
A bell rang loudly, above the noise of more gunshots and the shouts of men. Oliver felt himself being carried across rough ground, and then he saw and heard no more. Chapter 8. After the Robbery. The night was bitterly cold. A sharp wind whipped the fallen snow up into the air and blew it into every hole and corner. It was a night for the homeless to lie down and die, and for luckier people to sit close to their fires and thank God they were at home. In the workhouse where Oliver was born, Mrs. Corney, the widow in charge, was making tea by her fire. When she heard a knock at her door, she frowned and called out sharply, "Come in." The frown, however, was quickly changed to a sweet smile when she saw Mr. Bumble enter. "Hard weather, Mr. Bumble," said the widow. "Yes, indeed, ma'am," replied the beadle. "We've had to give out to the poor people in this town great quantities of bread and cheese today, and they're still complaining. Why, one man even came back and demanded some free firewood. What does he want that for? People are never satisfied. Give them one thing today, and tomorrow they'll ask for something else." Mrs. Corney agreed that it was very shocking. They discussed some workhouse business together, and then Mr. Bumble looked hopefully at the teapot. Mrs. Corney offered him some tea. Instantly, Mr. Bumble sat down by the fire and gave the widow such a warm smile that her face turned a delicate pink. She passed Mr. Bumble the teacup, and as he took it, he managed to give her hand a little stroke. "You're a kind-hearted woman, Mrs. Corney," said the beadle. "Oh, Mr. Bumble," said the widow, smiling shyly. For a while there was a friendly silence between them. Then Mr. Bumble moved his chair closer to the widow's. Mrs. Corney, of course, did not notice this, but when the beadle's arm began to slide around her waist, she felt she must make a small protest. Encouraged by this response, Mr. Bumble immediately gave her a kiss, but at this interesting moment there was a sudden knock at the door. Mr. Bumble jumped to his feet and went to the other end of the room. "Please, Mrs. Corney," said a voice outside. "Old Sally's going fast." "Well, what can I do to help her?" asked Mrs. Corney angrily. "Nothing, ma'am," replied the old woman outside, "but she says she has something to tell you, which you must hear. She won't die quietly till you come." Complaining loudly, Mrs. Corney asked Mr. Bumble to wait until she came back. Then she followed the old woman up the stairs. Old Sally lay in bed in a freezing cold room. The fire was so small and mean that it gave no warmth at all. Mrs. Corney bent over the bed, and the dying woman opened her eyes. "Come closer," she murmured. "Let me whisper in your ear." She held on to Mrs. Corney's arm and pulled her down towards her. "In this same room, I once helped a pretty young woman who came in with cut and bleeding feet, who gave birth to a boy and then died." "Well?" asked Mrs. Corney impatiently. "I robbed her. She was hardly dead before I stole it." "Stole what?" "It. The only thing she had. It was gold. It could have saved her life." "Gold? Who was this mother? Tell me." "She told me to look after it when she died." The old woman's mind was getting confused. "She trusted me, poor girl, and I stole it." "Quick, tell me, or it may be too late," said Mrs. Corney greedily. "What was it, and what was the boy's name?" The old woman could hardly speak. "Oliver. The gold I stole was—" "Yes, what?" The old woman fell back onto the bed, dead. Mrs. Corney hurried back to her room, where Mr. Bumble was still admiring her furniture and counting her silver teaspoons. They sat down again by the fire, and soon Mr. Bumble's arm returned to its previous position round Mrs. Corney's waist. It was not long before he asked her to marry him, and the widow happily accepted him. While they drank to celebrate the arrangement, Mrs. Corney told Mr. Bumble about old Sally's death and the unknown gold object which she had stolen from the dead body of the young woman. After many expressions of undying love, Mr. Bumble finally left the room and returned home, with bright visions of his future. While these events were happening in the workhouse, the Artful Dodger and Charlie Bates were playing cards in Fagin's house. The Dodger, as usual, was winning easily. Somehow he always seemed to know exactly what cards the other players had in their hands. Suddenly there was a faint ring on the bell downstairs, and Toby came in, the man who had gone with Bill Sikes and Oliver to rob the house in Chertsey. Fagin jumped to his feet.
"Where are they?" he screamed. "Sikes and the boy, where are they hiding?"
"We failed," said the robber.
"What happened?"
"They fired and hit the boy. We ran away with Oliver between us, and they chased us with dogs."
"And the boy? What about the boy?" gasped Fagin.
"His head was hanging down and he was cold. We needed to go faster, so we left him in a field, alive or dead. That's all I know about him." Fagin did not wait to hear any more. He gave an angry scream, ran out of the house, and hurried through the streets until he reached Bill Sikes' house. As he climbed the stairs, he thought,
"Well, Nancy, if there's anything going on here, I'll find out about it, however clever you are."
Nancy was alone upstairs in her room, her head on the table.
"She's been drinking again," thought Fagin.
As he closed the door, she woke up. He told her what had happened during the robbery. She said nothing, and her head returned to the table.
"And where do you think the boy is now, my dear?"
Fagin asked her, trying hard to see her face.
"Poor little child, left alone like that."
Nancy looked up.
"I hope the child's dead. Then he'd be happier than any of us." "What?" said Fagin in amazement. "It's better like that. The sight of the boy turns me against myself and all of you." "You're drunk." Fagin suddenly lost his temper. "The boy's worth a fortune to me, and now a drunken gang has lost him. And if Sikes doesn't return that boy to me, dead or alive, I'll tell the police about him, and I'll get Sikes hanged. Just remember that."
When Fagin left her, Nancy was already back in a drunken sleep, her head lying on the table once more. Fagin went out into the blackness of the night and walked home. He had reached the corner of his street and was searching in his pocket for his key when a dark figure came out of the shadows and crossed the road towards him. "I've been waiting here for 2 hours, Fagin," said the stranger. "Where have you been?"
"On your business, my dear," said Fagin, glancing at him uneasily.
"We'd better talk inside." The door closed behind them, and they crept quietly up to the top floor in order not to wake the sleeping boys downstairs. They sat in a dark room, the only light coming from a candle burning in the passage outside. The stranger's name was Monks, and he was in an evil mood. He listened to Fagin for a while, frowning heavily. "It was badly planned," he said angrily. "Couldn't you have made the boy into an ordinary thief and then got him arrested and sent out of the country for the rest of his life?"
"But he isn't like the other boys here," Fagin said. "I had nothing to frighten him with. Anyway, I've already helped you. After he was caught by the police stealing from the bookshop, I got Nancy to get him back, and then she felt sorry for him."
"Killer," Monks said impatiently.
"We can't afford to do that kind of thing," said Fagin. "But I can turn the boy into an ordinary thief now, and then Nancy will harden her heart against him. I know how women are. But if he's already dead—"
"That's not my fault," said Monks quickly. "I always said to you, do anything you want to him, but don't kill him. I wouldn't have been able to forget it if you had." Suddenly he jumped to his feet, staring at the wall opposite the door. "What's that?" he whispered, terrified.
"What? Where?"
cried Fagin.
"The shadow. I saw the shadow of a woman pass along that wall."
White-faced, they both ran from the room into the passage. The candle threw long shadows down the stairs, but there was no one there. They listened. Only silence filled the house.
"It was your imagination," said Fagin softly. "I swear I saw it," replied Monks.
They searched all the upstairs rooms. They were empty and as quiet as death. Monks grew calmer and eventually left the house at 1 o'clock in the morning. The chase down at Chertsey the previous night had not lasted long. There was a lot of noise of men shouting and dogs barking as the servants from the house pursued the robbers across the fields. But Sykes and Toby wasted no time. They dropped Oliver's unconscious body in a field and disappeared into the fog and the darkness in different directions. The three pursuers lost enthusiasm for the chase and agreed among themselves that it was much too dangerous to continue. They returned to the house, keeping close together and trying to look brave. Morning came, but Oliver still lay in the field as if dead. It began to rain heavily, and after a while Oliver opened his eyes. His left arm was covered in blood and hurting badly. He felt so weak he could hardly stand, but he knew that if he stayed where he was, he would die. Gasping with pain, he forced himself to his feet and with slow, shaky steps began to walk. He had no idea where he was going, and moved forward mechanically, as though in a dream. After a while his feet found a road, and he looked round and saw a house in the distance. He decided he would rather die near human beings than in a cold field, so he turned his steps towards the house. As he came nearer, he realized that the house was familiar, and he felt faint with terror. But where else could he go? With a last effort, he crawled up the path and knocked on the door, then fell exhausted on the step. It was now mid-morning. Inside the house the men servants were still describing the night's adventures to the cook and the servant girl, who gasped with appreciative horror at every exciting moment. They were all enjoying themselves very much, when there came a knock at the door. Pale with fright, they all stared at each other. Nobody was keen to answer the knock, so eventually they all went, including the dogs. Very cautiously they opened the door and saw nothing more alarming than poor Oliver curled up in a sad little heap on the step. Then one of the men gave a shout, seized the boy by a leg and pulled him into the hall. "Here he is!" he cried excitedly. "Here's the thief! I shot him last night!" A young lady appeared at the top of the stairs. "What's going on here? Quiet, please. Is this poor boy very hurt?" "Very," said the servant, proudly. "Then one of you go to town as fast as you can and fetch a policeman and Dr. Losberne. The rest of you help to carry the boy upstairs and put him to bed. Treat him kindly, I beg you."